We also need to kind of practice our technique a little bit. So I want to just talk about that really quickly. So if you look up at the board, I'll explain what we want to do. So that's good. So hopefully it's recording my voice right now. Previously, when I did a recording, it did not, which was kind of upsetting. So we want to play around with the three different vocabulary that we're going to be using. So I think if we just create little 3-inch, so 1, 2, 3. And we don't need these to be really big. So let's just make them 3-inch by 1/4 of an inch strips. Like so. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and line up 2 more 1/4 inch strips. So there's 3 of them, and then I can just come over here and do the caps on the left side and on the right side like that. So you can see I've got 3-inch 3-inch by 1/4 inch strips. Does everybody understand that? And then what we'll do is we'll play around with, we can start with, let's do hatching first. So if I start by making these marks, relatively far apart, and then as I get to this side, I leave it completely blank. And then I'm going to come in and I'm going to go in between those marks. And then by the time I get to this side, I'm going to stop. You see these last 2 are still that initial distance apart. And then we still have the white. And then we can come in and we can go in between them. And then stop short of that. You following me? And then coming back and drawing in between them. And each time we hatch over, we stop short of where we were previously. And we're blocking out more of the white of the page. And notice that with hatching, which is what this first one is, all my marks are what relative to one another? Parallel to one another. And what are you starting to see happening? Yeah, so by the time I get to this end, what do I have? Solid black. Do you guys see how I have a gradation of tone there? So we'll call these gradient studies. The first one is hatching. The second one is cross-hatching. So here we can start with the same direction, relatively far apart, stopping short of the end. And now we're going to go at a cross angle, stopping short of where we left off. And then we're going to go in the opposite direction, stopping short of where we left off. And then we could go this way. Again, stopping short of where we left off. And then we can start over again with our vertical, stopping short of where we left off with those horizontals. And then the opposite direction. And, you know, that whole notion of stopping short of, like where I left off, sometimes you get lost as to where you left off. So the main thing is to just keep observing, am I getting a gradient? Does it look like I'm getting a gradient so far? Yeah. Yes? And of course, by the time you get to this side, it really doesn't matter what direction you go in, so long as when you get to the end, you go completely black and you have that smooth gradient. Does that make sense to everybody? And then finally, and my most favorite is the stipple, right? So here, you're doing dots. And by the time you get to this side, again, you're stopping short. And then you're doing another pass, stopping short. And then you're doing another pass, stopping short. And then another pass. And what I'm doing here is I'm looking for spaces in between the previous dots that I've made. And really trying to gauge it based on what I'm seeing at the top. Or I should say, the gradient that I have above. And this one, I like them because they're the most controllable. The stipple, I mean. But at the same time, they're really tedious. So everybody look, I'll show you a little trick. So you can see there I've got a fairly decent gradient, but Ashley, could you hand me that? But probably with this, I'm kind of like on this side of the spectrum. I'm not getting all the way down to the dark yet, whereas these, I've got the full spectrum. Does that make sense to everybody? So what I would do here, watch, this is a cheat. Go ahead and just color it in like that. Give yourself the black with whatever technique you want to use, hatching, cross-hatching, or scribble. And then try to blend that in other words, if you start with your dark, you can make the viewer think that you stippled that black. As long as you're creating a gradient that moves you to that solid black that is derived or manifested through your stipple. So that can be like, could you imagine if I just kept doing the stipple program all the way to the end? It would take me forever, right? But so long as I gradate into that dark using a stipple, my little reserves of white that are adjacent to it, you can see, look, bam, done. Does that make sense? And that looks like a pretty good gradient. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yep.
And then what we can do is we can just take our little shapes and play around with practicing so if I've got a light side and a dark side up against the light, what do I want to do? What do I want to have up against the light? Yeah, my darkest dark. So here I've tried a hatch, cross hatch rather. And you can see that that gives me a nice sense of form, right? I could come over on this side and do a hatch. And I've got a really nice sense of mass and dimensionality. I could try a stipple. So basically we're just practicing using one of our shapes or several of our shapes. What type of procedure for shading or creating gradient we're going to use. Yeah. And then on this side I would do a very spacious stipple at the side and then let them become further spaced apart as I approach that boundary of my dark and light sides. So basically, in addition to finishing your creative process, I want you to do the 3 gradient studies, creating 3-inch by 1/4-inch tall rectangles, 1 hatching, 1 cross hatching, 1 stipple that go from value 1 through 10, and then do some little shape studies using the shapes that you're using in your composition. And applying one or more So, for instance, in this shape, I've got a much more complex shape. Everybody look at it. So I want the light to come from the front. So I want this front edge to be my lightest. So the side needs to be in shadow. Notice that I'm making my marks parallel with the front and back edge. And then if I do one on the top, make it more in shadow, I want to have marks that are parallel with the front and back edge. Does that make sense to everybody? Now, in order to separate the top from the side, what do I need to do? Do I leave them the same? Or do I make the top or the side different? Different. So, Leah, what should I do? Make the top darker or the side darker? Make the side darker. So I'm going to hatch over here with a cross hatch. You guys see how that makes the top, side, and front different. Each one different, one from the other. Does that make sense? Now, this is the same as this, right? So I should probably do something like this underneath here. That makes sense? And then this is like the top. So I should make it like the top. This is like this and this as far as the sides are concerned. And this is going to be like the bottom floor of that. Now, this area is inside the shape, yes? So how should it be different than what we see on the outside of the shape? Darker, right? Because it's inside. So watch. If I push this really dark here, up against the edge where this goes underneath this, you guys see how that creates a nice sense of light and space there? And then here I could do the same thing. Make it darker here and get lighter as it goes behind that edge. Or I could have left, no, I wouldn't want to make this lighter because it's against a light area. So I would need to make it darker. This could probably get darker as it goes behind this edge. So create a little gradient there. And then maybe this too. You guys see how as I create contrast at the edges of these plane changes, the form becomes clearer. So I'm going to create a stronger gradation here up against this edge. And what does that do for that edge? Makes it stronger, yes? Maybe here as well. So do you guys see how I'm applying these gradients to each plane in my shapes? Actually, I think I want this top to be a little bit darker in general. So I'm going to tweak it. I feel like the top or the front is very plain. So I'm going to break it up a little bit by maybe using some of this stipple. Does that make sense to everybody?